The summer Vera Holm arrived in Cutter's Bend. The valley had already made up its mind about her. It decided in the first 10 minutes, the way small communities always do, by the arithmetic of appearances. A woman traveling alone in a salt-trusted pickup, with a deed to 40 dry acres, and an expression that gave nothing away, amounted in the community's cold calculation to a figure that did not add up. The valley looked at the sum and rounded it down to 0. What the valley did not understand, and would spend 16 months learning, is that Vera Holm had been rounding figures her whole life, and she never once rounded down. She rounded up, and she waited, and she let the land do the rest of the arithmetic for her. She did not know, on that first August afternoon, that the land had already been at work on the problem for longer than she had been alive. The reckoning at the Cattleman's Hall on a Wednesday evening in October of the following year was not the beginning of the verdict. It was only the moment the valley finally heard what the land had been saying all along in a whisper, so low and so patient that only one person in the entire county had thought to stop and listen. She stood at the back of the hall that October night with her hands loose at her sides and her boots still carrying the rust-colored clay of her lower pasture, and the crowd in front of her was desperate in the way that only drought-broken farming people can be desperate, quietly, without theater. The way men and women go quiet when they have added their own columns and found the sum does not cover the winter. Aldous Mercer stood at the front of the room in a pressed linen jacket the color of old cream, his left hand resting on a fold-out table as though he were bracing himself against a strong wind that only he could feel. And he was speaking the language of emergency, of consolidation, of the consortium's generosity in a time of regional hardship. He was very smooth. He had been smooth in August of the previous year as well, and he would be smooth until the moment he was not. And the moment he was not was now approximately 40 minutes away. Vera watched him and said nothing, which was a habit of hers that people mistook for uncertainty. It was not uncertainty. It was the same stillness she had learned from 50 animals who had taught her, slowly and without any interest in her schedule, that the ground gives up its secrets only to those who are quiet long enough to hear the offering. But we are getting to the ending before we have told the beginning, which is a disservice to the beginning because the beginning is where the whole thing lives. Cut back 14 months to the last week of August, when Vera Holm pulled off the county road onto a gravel track that the deed called a drive and the land called an aspiration. 40 acres. The previous owner had broken the price 3 times trying to move it, and had finally listed it with a bank that did not want it either, which was how a woman with $1,100 to her name and a commercial real estate license she was quietly surrendering walked into the county assessor's office and walked out with a deed in the pocket of her canvas jacket. She had paid $900 for the land, which left her $200, a tent, a cast-iron skillet, and a second-hand auger she did not yet know how to operate. The 40 acres sat in a bowl between 2 low limestone ridges that caught the afternoon heat and held it the way a cup palm holds water, which is to say poorly. The pasture was thin and pale, the color of old straw, and a seasonal creek bed ran along the eastern edge of the property in a channel so dry it had begun to crack like the glaze on old pottery. There was a barn with 3 walls and a half a roof, and a hand-dug cistern that contained. When Vera lifted the cover and looked down, a dark ellipse of water, approximately the size of a dinner table. That was the whole of the property's recommendation. She stood and looked at it for a long time in the August heat, with the cicadas running their dry machinery in the scrub oaks, and she said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. The Piglets came the next morning. She had seen the posting tacked to the board outside the feed store in town. 50 wiener pigs, 8 weeks old, priced to move, owner relocated, call before noon. The number given was a cell phone with an out-of-county prefix, and when Vera called it, a man answered in the flat, exhausted voice of someone who has already moved on emotionally from whatever he is selling. $15 for the lot. He said, if she could come today and bring her own transport. He said they had not been eating well. That was how he put it. They had not been eating well. He did not elaborate. She borrowed a livestock trailer from the woman at the gas station who was storing it for a nephew in Odessa, drove 40 minutes south, and came back by mid-afternoon with 50 wieners in various stages of decline, packed into a trailer that smelled of old panic. The feed store owner, a man named Burkett, who wore the same plaid shirt every day and had strong opinions about everything, was standing outside when she made the return trip through town, and he watched the trailer roll past, with his thumbs in his belt loops, and the expression of a man witnessing something he will enjoy describing later. He called over to the two men on the bench in front of the barber shop and pointed and said something that got a laugh. And the laugh followed her down the road for longer than it should have because the cab windows were down and the air was still. She filed it away under the heading of figures she had already counted and dismissed. The feed dealer, a younger man named Tripp, who worked the afternoon shift and who had never in his professional life seen 50 starving wieners arrive in Cutter's Bend without a functioning operation to receive them, drove out to her property the following week on what he described as a delivery, but which was plainly an inspection born of curiosity and mild pity. He walked around the three-walled barn while Vera unloaded sacks, and when he had completed his assessment, he told her, not unkindly, that the land was wrong for pigs. He said the soil was too thin, too alkaline, too dry, and that without a reliable water source, she would be hauling from town inside a month and losing money on every gallon. He said the county extension office had a buyout program for failed small operations, and he would be happy to get her the number. She thanked him for the delivery and handed him a check, and he left. And she watched the dust settle behind his truck and then turned back to the barn, where 50 small animals were making the sounds that living creatures make when they are still deciding whether to commit to the effort. She named the largest one Bartholomew because he was black across the shoulders and white everywhere else, and he walked with a pronounced dignity that the word Bartholomew seemed to honor. He was perhaps 22 pounds, which was approximately 8 pounds short of what a healthy 8-week-old wiener should be. The others were in similar or worse condition. She ran the numbers on a yellow legal pad by lantern light in the tent. 50 animals consuming 6 pounds of feed per day each, which she could not afford at scale. The cistern holding perhaps 3 weeks of water for the herd if she rationed carefully, her remaining funds amounting to $163 after the initial feed purchase. The arithmetic of survival. Run honest and run cold, said she had about 5 weeks before the column of debits overtook the column of what she had left. She did not sleep well that first week. She slept in short installments, woke before dawn, fed by headlamp, moved the herd between the 3 sections of pasture she had divided with salvaged wire, and watched them root. They were extraordinary rooters even in their weakened state, those pigs. They turned the pale alkaline soil with a patient, compulsive thoroughness that seemed less like appetite and more like vocation. She watched them and took note and said nothing, which was her way. It was toward the end of the second week that Aldous Mercer came for the first time. He came in a white, extended cab truck, so clean it looked as though it had been driven from a dealership directly to her gate without touching the road. And he introduced himself as a regional coordinator for a consortium called Valley Livestock Partners, which had, he explained, interests in 7 counties, and a particular interest in distressed operations where the underlying land had potential for reuse. He was perhaps 55, silver-haired, and he had the quality of warmth that runs on an internal battery rather than drawing from any genuine source. He offered her his card, which was heavyweight stock with embossed lettering, and he looked at the barn and the pasture and the pigs, and he said, with an expression of calibrated sympathy, that he imagined she was finding it a difficult adjustment. He said the land was known to be unforgiving. He said the consortium had been watching the listing for some time, and they were prepared to make a fair offer for the parcel, including the livestock, which they would value at cost of feed to date plus a 10% goodwill premium. He said this as though he were doing her a favor so large it embarrassed him to enumerate it. She asked him what the offer on the land itself would be. He named a number that was $1,400, which was $500 more than she had paid, and he presented the $500 as evidence of generosity. She told him she would think about it. He said he would give her until Friday, and drove away on the road that had remained perfectly clean for him in both directions. She did not think about it. She was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about where Bartholomew spent his mornings. He had developed a preference for the southeast corner of the pasture, below the limestone ledge where the second ridge came down and met the property line. And every morning, without exception, he led a loose procession of 7 or 8 others to that corner, and they rooted there with a concentration that was different from their rooting elsewhere. The soil there was darker. She had noticed that separately, and after a rain, a thin, disappointing rain in the 3rd week of September that amounted to less than half an inch, the soil in that corner had stayed dark for 4 days, while everywhere else it had dried back to ash color by the following afternoon. She took the auger to that corner on a Thursday morning and ran it down 18 inches and pulled up a core of soil that was noticeably damp. She ran it down again 6 inches further, and the resistance changed in a way she felt in her forearms before she consciously registered it. She pulled the core and held it and looked at it and said nothing for a long time. It was the following Saturday that old Ditsaros came over the ridge. She was 81 years old, or she said so, and she had emigrated from a country she referred to only as the old country, with a specificity that suggested the name of the country was nobody's business. She had farmed the 12 acres on the other side of the North Ridge for 34 years, growing things that the county extension office had no category for, and that she preserved in jars with handwritten labels in a language Vera could not read. She arrived with a cloth sack and sat on the overturned feed bucket that served as Vera's porch furniture and accepted a cup of the bitter coffee Vera made on the camp stove without comment. And she looked at the pasture and the pigs and the limestone ledge for a long time before she spoke. When she spoke, she said, in the accented, unhurried cadence of someone translating, not from another language, but from another way of thinking entirely, "The earth does not hide what it has. It only waits to be asked properly." A pig asks properly. A person with enough silence can hear the answer the pig already knows. She said it as though it were an observation rather than advice, which is the way observations that matter are usually delivered. Then she opened her cloth sack and produced a soil probe of a design Vera had not seen, a hand-forged instrument with a flanged head, and she said that in the old country this was the tool you used when the pigs had told you something and you wanted to confirm. She handed it over. Then she drank her coffee and talked about her tomatoes, which had done unexpectedly well despite the dry summer, and after a while she walked back over the ridge. Vera used the probe that afternoon. She worked the southeast corner for 2 hours, methodically, quadrant by quadrant, reading the resistance the way Dit had showed her with a single demonstrating push, at a depth of 26 inches in a 3-foot radius centered approximately 8 feet from the limestone face. The probe entered something that was not soil. She felt the change before she confirmed it. She stood up and looked at the limestone ledge, and looked at the dark soil, and looked at Bartholomew watching her with his peculiar composed attention from 15 feet away, and she understood, with the clarity that comes not as a shout, but as a soft, definitive hush, that she was standing above a wet-weather spring fed from the limestone aquifer running under the ridge, and that it was continuous and it was not small. She did not tell anyone. She spent 4 days thinking about what she had, and whether she understood it correctly, and what to do with it. And at the end of those 4 days, she had her answer. She hired a water well contractor from a town 2 counties over, a woman who came with a small percussion rig and no connection to the social architecture of Cutter's Bend, and they opened the spring properly and cased it and capped it with a hand pump, and the water that came up was cold and iron-rich and clean, and it ran. The contractor said she had not seen a flow rate like this from a shallow limestone spring in 11 years of work in this part of the country. and she filled out her paperwork and drove away, and Vera paid her with the last $80 in her account, and did not regret a cent of it. She had water. She banked that fact like an ember under ash, kept it low, kept it covered, gave it no air and no attention in public, and let the town go on thinking whatever the town was thinking. The town, as far as she could determine, was still thinking she was a failure that had not yet completed the formality of failing. Burkett, at the feed store, stopped waiving the delivery minimum, which was the community's way of declining to invest in her survival. Tripp, who had been professionally kind on his first visit, gave her the extension office number a second time when she came in for supplies, unprompted, as though the number might have been more persuasive with the passage of time. Mercer came back in late October with a revised offer that was $1,900 and a folder of paperwork that explained, in helpful detail, all the ways the land was unsuitable for sustained livestock operation. He said it was his final offer, and he said it with the warm authority of a man who has never had a final offer refused. She told him she would pass, and he nodded with the patient charity of someone who has watched people make poor decisions before and has made peace with the fact. He drove away on his clean road. The pigs were not starving anymore. That was the thing the town could not see from the road, and she gave them no occasion to see it from closer. The 50 weaners had become, in the space of 9 weeks, 48 animals of striking vitality. She had lost 2 in the first week, 1 to failure to thrive, and 1 to a cause she never determined, and she grieved them both briefly and specifically, and moved on. The remaining 48 had access to the spring water and to 3 acres of pasture that the rooting had opened and aerated and effectively tilled to a depth that the thin alkaline topsoil had never previously achieved. And she had seeded it with a mix that included native legumes and did as recommendation. A low-growing variety from a packet with a handwritten label. And the pasture had come on in a way that the pale, exhausted land had no business producing. The animals were growing at a rate she tracked on the legal pad with the same scrupulous attention she had given the arithmetic of survival. The arithmetic of survival, as of the first week of November, had reversed its direction entirely. She was not yet in profit, but she was no longer falling. She had stopped the fall quietly, with wet limestone water and a black and white pig who walked like a professor, and she had told no one. It was a Saturday in December when Jonas came. He was 10 years old, and he came over the fence rather than through the gate, which she appreciated as efficient, and he sat on the top rail and watched her feed, with the self-contained attention of a child who has learned that things go better when adults do not notice you assessing them. He had a little brother with a medical condition. Their family was managing on a hardware store income, and he had no particular place to be on Saturday mornings because the small house his family rented from the Burkett property had no yard, and the town had no park. And December in Cutter's Bend presented limited options for a boy who thought in straight, patient lines. He sat on the rail for 3 Saturdays before he said anything, and what he said was about Bartholomew. That one knows things. She said, that one does. He said, what does he know? She said, right now he knows there are some good roots at the base of the old cedar in the east corner. The boy looked, and Bartholomew was there, and after that Jonas came every Saturday, and he named the rest of the 48 in an orderly way, working through a naming system only. He fully understood, but which she respected, as both systematic and peculiar, which are 2 qualities she admired. He told her one morning in February that Burkett had said at the feed store that she was going to lose the whole herd by summer. He reported this in the flat, informational tone of a boy who is conveying data rather than passing judgment. Wall. She said she appreciated knowing. He said he didn't think Burkett was right. She said, why not? He looked at the animals for a moment and said, because they don't look like animals that are planning to die. She thought that was as good a piece of livestock assessment as she had heard from anyone in the county. March brought the outside validator in the form of a woman named Castellano, who arrived in a restaurant supply van and had been given Vera's number by the contractor who had cased the spring, because the contractor had mentioned to a chef she knew in the city that she had seen some unusual pigs on an unusual property, and the chef had passed it along. Castellano walked the pasture in rubber boots and looked at the animals, and asked about feed and water and handling, and she cut to the matter with the efficiency of a woman who has spent 20 years sourcing product and has no patience for theater. She asked Vera to name her price per head, dressed weight, for as many as Vera could supply on a 60-day cycle. Vera named a price that was 40% above the regional commodity rate. Castellano said yes without negotiating, which told Vera the number was still low, and she filed that away for the next conversation. The check that cleared the following week was the first time in Vera's life that a deposit in her account had contained a comma. It was not a large comma, but it was a comma. She looked at it in the column on her phone's banking app and let herself feel for exactly the length of time it took to breathe in and breathe out, something approaching triumph. Then she put the phone away and went to check on the spring. The drought arrived in May, the way catastrophe always arrives, not as a single event, but as the slow cumulative withdrawal of mercy. The seasonal creek bed, which had been dry when Vera arrived and had made one brief, tentative appearance in February, withdrew for what would prove to be a final time. The water table across the valley fell through May and June, with a speed that unnerved even the old-timers who had seen dry years but had not seen this particular quality of dry, which was less like a drought and more like the country deciding it was finished with the arrangement. The bluegrass pastures turned from green to bronze in 3 weeks. The stock ponds, which had been the operational heart of the valley's conventional cattle ranches, began their retreat from the banks inward, shrinking their circles with the patient inevitability of a closing eye. Burkett's operation was the first to be spoken of in the past tense. He ran 300 head of commercial cattle on leased pasture across the valley floor, all of it dependent on surface water and municipal supplementation, and by June, the cost of trucking water had outrun the value of the cattle at any realistic market price. He sold down to 90 head, and then to 40, and then he stopped talking about it at the feed store, which was itself a kind of statement. The two ranches north of the highway began consolidation conversations with Valley Livestock Partners, and Mercer's white truck appeared with increasing frequency on the county road, moving between operations with the quiet purpose of a man whose moment has arrived on schedule. The spring did not care about any of this. The limestone aquifer that fed it ran deep under the ridge and was recharged by a watershed that extended into the next county, and what it offered to the surface was indifferent to the calendar and indifferent to the hardship of the people living above it. It ran in May as it had run in November. It ran in June as it had run in February. The pasture, aerated by months of methodical rooting and seeded with varieties that had deeper root structures than the bluegrass standard, retained its moisture at a depth where the sun could not find it, and it stayed, in relative terms, alive. She had 44 animals by June, Bartholomew still the largest and still the most composed, and the pasture was carrying them without the supplemental feed she had needed in winter. She was supplying Castellano on the agreed cycle, and she had begun a second arrangement with a regional distributor who had heard about the product from a buyer who had heard about it from Castellano, which is how good things travel in that business when they travel at all. She had rebuilt the barn to 2 full walls and a complete roof, and she had poured a concrete pad around the spring housing, and she had planted a kitchen garden in the deep-tilled soil the herd had opened along the north fence, and Didisaros came by on Thursdays to look at it and make suggestions in her unhurried way. The garden was producing in the drought with a stubbornness that made Dit nod, with the satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. It was Mercer who began the final campaign in July. He came 3 times in 4 weeks. The first visit was another offer, now at $4,000 for the parcel, which was presented with the gravity of a significant revision and the implication that the consortium's patience was a finite resource. She declined. The second visit came with a man from the County Water Authority, whom Mercer introduced as a colleague, and they walked her fence line, and the colleague took measurements and said things in a technical vocabulary she was not supposed to fully understand, and she understood every word of it. Because she had spent 6 months reading groundwater hydrology texts borrowed from the library in the county seat. She said nothing that revealed this. The third visit came alone, and Mercer did not make an offer. He said in his smoothest register that the county was considering designating her spring as a shared community resource under a drought emergency ordinance, and that she might want to consider the consortium's offer as a cleaner alternative to a drawn-out regulatory process, because those processes, he said, could be very hard on a small operation without legal representation. He said it warmly, the way men say things that are intended to be heard as threats while being structured as concern. She thanked him for coming, and he left, and she stood on the concrete pad beside the spring housing and listened to the water running, and felt very precisely the shape of what he was doing and the shape of what she was going to do about it. She asked Jonas on the following Saturday whether he had seen anyone on the property when she was in town. He said yes, last Tuesday. A man in a white truck came and looked around for about 20 minutes. She asked what he was doing. Jonas said he was writing things down. She asked what things, and Jonas, who was 10 years old and possessed of the observational precision of someone who has spent a year watching pigs think, said he wrote down the number on the spring housing and the length of the concrete pad, and he counted the pigs twice and wrote down the same wrong number both times. She asked what number he wrote. Jonas said 39. She said, how many are there? Jonas said 44, same as always, but the man counted from the road and didn't come into the pasture, so he missed the 5 that were in the shade of the cedar. She nodded and said thank you, and Jonas went back to his conversation with Bartholomew. 39, she thought. She had 39 to work with. She turned the number over, the way you turn a key in a lock, feeling for the place where it fits. And she found it quickly, because the number had only one door it could open. The Cattlemen's Hall meeting was called by the County Extension Office in response to what the printed notice described as an acute regional water emergency, and it was attended by everyone with a stake in the valley's agricultural future, which in a drought year means everyone in the valley without exception. The hall smelled of the summer it had accumulated, dust and worry, and the particular undertone of men and women who have been outside in heat for months and carry it in their clothes. Vera arrived after most people and stood at the back, and Jonas was there with his father, who had come, because the hardware business depended on the farms, and the farms were in the condition they were in. Mercer had organized himself at the front table with the authority of a man who has prepared extensively for the argument he believes he is about to have. He spoke about the consortium's proposal to purchase the home property and the spring rights and to manage distribution of the water as a shared resource under a consortium management agreement, which would allow participating ranchers to access water at a per-unit rate that he assured the room was fair and that he did not write on the board. He spoke about the regulatory timeline and the drought ordinance, and the fact that the consortium had the legal infrastructure to move quickly where an individual owner did not. He said it with warmth. He said it as though he were presenting a gift. He was 45 minutes into this presentation when he said, in passing, to support a point about herd viability, that the home operation was running approximately 39 animals, which he described as a marginal herd on a marginally productive parcel, and that the spring's full potential was not being realized by its current stewardship. 39. Vera said, from the back of the room, the quiet carrying voice of someone who has spent months speaking at the volume that animals hear, that she ran 44 animals, not 39, and she was curious what methodology produced the lower count and specifically on what date that count had been taken, and from what position relative to the cedar in the east corner. The room went very still. Mercer looked at her, and the warmth in his expression ran on its battery for a moment, and then the battery failed. And underneath it was the flat, undecorated face of a man who has been caught at the edge of the thing he was about to do and does not have a prepared response. He said the figure was an estimate, She said from whose visit and on what date. He said the consortium conducted routine assessments of neighboring properties as part of its regional management function. The room, which had been waiting to see which direction the stillness would break, broke in her direction, the way a field of grain breaks in the direction the wind is actually blowing, all at once and without any individual stalk deciding separately. She walked to the front of the room. She had not planned a speech, and she did not give one. She said that the spring on her property produced at a rate she would be happy to document, and that it was running now and would continue to run through the drought because of its source aquifer, and that she had no interest in selling it to anyone. She said she was willing to discuss water access arrangements with any rancher in the valley who needed it, and that she had one condition: that they come to the work, that they send someone to the property on the day she specified to participate in the maintenance of the spring infrastructure and the pasture that protected the watershed. Because the spring did not run for free, and it did not run without stewardship, and the stewardship was what she was offering alongside the water. She said, the rate for the water itself was whatever a family could manage. She said that was not charity. She said the water was the land's to give and had always been, and she was the land steward, not its owner, in any sense that the land itself recognized, and the appropriate compensation for stewardship was the labor that sustains it. She said it plainly, without drama, and she returned to the back of the room. Mercer left without the meeting formally adjourning. He gathered his folder and walked out with the composure of a man who is recalculating, and no one in the room turned to watch him go. It was Burkett who came to her first. He came 4 days later on a Thursday morning, driving his own truck for once, without the plaid shirt, wearing instead a faded work jacket that told a different story than the plaid shirt ever had. He stood at the gate and said he had 40 head left and they needed water, and he could send his son 3 mornings a week. He said this looking at the ground between his boots, and then he looked up, and there was in his face the particular quality of a man who has run his own arithmetic all the way to the bottom and found that what is left is the thing he should have started with. She said 3 mornings was fine. She said 7 in the morning. He nodded. Then he said, in a voice that barely carried across the gate between them, that he reckoned he had been wrong about the pigs. She said the pigs hadn't worried about it. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape of the territory where one had been. 3 more operations sent people in the following week, and then 2 more, and within a month there were 7 families participating in the maintenance schedule, which Jonas tracked on a calendar tacked to the barn wall with his characteristic orderly precision and occasional dry annotation. The pasture around the spring housing expanded as the maintenance work expanded, and Dida Saros came one Thursday with her neighbor, who turned out to be a retired hydrologist, which she mentioned as an afterthought, and the hydrologist confirmed what Vera had understood from her reading and added 2 details she had not. And the picture of what the spring could sustain over the long term became both larger and more specific. The rains came in late September, earlier than anyone had allowed themselves to hope. They came on a Tuesday, not dramatically, not in the way of storms that have a rhetorical point to make, but steadily, in the patient, continuous way of rains that mean to stay and intend to fill what they find. The creek bed to the east filled from the bottom up over 3 days, the way a vessel fills, from the ground source outward, which told Vera something about the hydrology she filed carefully in the growing document she was keeping. The valley's pastures began their slow return to themselves, the bronze releasing green from below in the particular gradient. That means the roots are still there, still viable, still committed. She was standing at the spring housing on the Saturday after the rains began, when Jonas came over the fence in his usual way and stood beside her. They watched Bartholomew conduct his morning assessment of the southeast corner with his habitual gravity. Jonas said that Bartholomew probably knew the rains were coming before anybody. She said she thought so too. He said, how does a pig know that? She said the same way the land knows. It listens to things that don't have words, and when you have been quiet enough for long enough, you start to hear them too. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to all propositions that deserved it. Then he said he was going to be a soil scientist when he was older. She said that was a good idea. He said, or a pig farmer. She said both were compatible. He nodded and went to check on Bartholomew, who received his attention with the dignified calm of an elder who is accustomed to being consulted. Diet came the following Thursday, in the cool of the rain-washed morning, and sat on the feed bucket that had been joined now by 2 salvaged chairs, and she accepted the coffee, which had improved considerably in quality over the year. And she looked at the pasture and the spring and the working barn with the expression she used when the world had arrived at an arrangement she considered correct. She said in her unhurried translating way that the earth does not forget who asked it properly, and a person who learns to ask tends to find the answer has been waiting, patient as stone, since long before the asking. She said it as though she were confirming something they had both already known, which was, Vera thought, exactly right. The 44 animals moved in the morning light across the pasture that had been opened and remade by their own labor over 16 months, and the spring ran cold and steady behind its concrete housing, and the valley was filling again from the inside out. And Vera Holmes stood on the 40 acres that everyone in Cutter's Bend had agreed were worth nothing, and felt, without any performance of the feeling that she had arrived, not because the town had changed its verdict. Verdicts issued by people change on the same terms they were issued, by appearances, by convenience, by whatever the arithmetic of the moment requires. She had not come to be vindicated by Burkett's almost smile, or the families on the maintenance schedule, or the 7 operations that now depended, in varying degrees, on the water that Bartholomew had found before anyone was looking. She had come because the land had been holding this particular answer for longer than any of them had been alive, and someone needed to be quiet enough to hear the question. She had been quiet enough. That was all. That was, she thought, everything. She walked back across the pasture in the September morning, with the rain still soft in the air, and the animals moving around her in their orderly grazing circuit. Bartholomew at the east end, beneath the cedar, where the ground was always darkest and always truest. And she felt the slight give of the well-rooted soil under her boots, and knew it for what it was. Not a property, not a parcel, not a figure in a column. A conversation, long in progress, that she had finally learned to join.
Il me va bien, hein? Il me va bien en plus, hein? Merci Jenny, il est lavé, séché, porté, exprès pour ce soir. Alors, vous le verrez pas entièrement en jeu, bien évidemment. Le petit hamster, elle est incroyable. Elle est incroyable. Merci, plein de cœurs, plein de cœurs, plein de cœurs pour Jenny. Ah ouais, la taille est nickel. Alors, il va me tenir chaud par contre parce que, putain, la qualité, il est épais quoi. Mais il est trop beau. Il est vraiment trop beau. Je suis trop contente. Bon, je le mettrai pas à tous les streams. Bien sûr.